Welcome to Monk's Temple. Right now, before we go anywhere together, I want you to notice something simple. Feel your breath moving in and out. Just feel it. Notice the weight of your body against whatever is holding you up. Hear the sounds around you, near and far. And notice that there is something inside you that is aware of all this. Something that watches your breath, that feels your body, that hears the sounds. That aware part has been here your whole life, watching everything change while never changing itself. That part is who you really are. And it is the reason this story matters. There is one question that sits beneath every other question human beings have ever asked. It is not about God or the afterlife or the meaning of existence. It is more personal than that. The question is simply this: why do I suffer? Why do I feel anxious when nothing is wrong? Why do I feel lonely in a room full of people? Why do I feel like I am not enough, even after achieving everything I wanted? Why does my own mind feel like an enemy so much of the time? Every religion, every philosophy, every spiritual path is really just an attempt to answer this one question. And every person, whether they know it or not, is living out their own answer every single day. 2,300 years ago, two completely different worlds crashed into each other on the plains of what is now Pakistan. One world had spent centuries mastering the outside. They perfected war and politics and logic. They built empires and created art that still amazes us. This was ancient Greece. The other world had spent centuries mastering the inside. They perfected meditation and consciousness and the art of letting go. They produced men who owned nothing, not even clothes, yet radiated a peace that made kings feel poor. This was ancient India, and the tradition that would become Buddhism. When these two worlds met, something impossible happened. The warriors, the conquerors, the masters of the outside, looked at the monks, the meditators, the masters of the inside, and they saw something they had never seen before. They saw human beings who had solved the problem. They saw people who did not suffer. Try to feel what that would be like. You are a Greek soldier in Alexander's army. You have walked thousands of miles. You have fought dozens of battles. You have seen your friends die screaming. You believe that power means getting what you want. That is the only success you know. Then you meet a man who has nothing. No land, no weapons, no gold, no family. He sits under a tree in the blazing heat, naked except for dust on his skin. But when you look into his eyes, you see something that both terrifies and fascinates you. You see complete peace. You see a man who wants nothing, fears nothing, regrets nothing. You see a man who has solved the problem. Your general, Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, walks up to this monk. He offers him riches and a place in his court. The monk does not move. He threatens to kill him. The monk does not flinch. Alexander, for the first time in his life, is powerless. His power, which conquered nations, means nothing to this man. Because this man found a power that cannot be taken away. The Greeks called these men naked philosophers. But that misses everything. They were not philosophers building logical systems. They were living proof of a radical truth. The truth that suffering is optional. Let that land. Suffering is optional. Most of us live believing suffering is just part of life. We believe that if we are anxious, it is because the world is stressful. If we are angry, it is because someone wronged us. We believe our feelings are caused by what happens to us. The monks discovered something else. They saw that the link between what happens and how we feel is not direct. There is something in between. There is a filter. There is a storyteller. And that storyteller is the mind itself. Something happens. The mind tells a story about it. The story causes the suffering. Not what happened. The story. Someone insults you. The insult is just sound waves. The suffering comes from the story you tell about those sound waves. It means they don't respect me. It means I am not good enough. The story hurts. Not the sound. You lose your job. The loss is just a change. The suffering comes from the story. It means I am a failure. It means my future is dangerous. The story hurts. Not the change. The monks learned to see the story for what it is. Just a story. A construction of the mind. Not reality. And by seeing it clearly, they loosened its grip. They could have the experience without believing the story. And without the story, there was no suffering. This is what the Greek soldiers saw in those monks' eyes. Freedom. Real freedom. Not the freedom to conquer others, but the freedom to be completely at peace no matter what happened. One soldier could not forget what he saw. His name was Pyro. Before the war, he was a painter, trained to observe carefully. What he observed in India changed him forever. He spent months with these monks, learning their methods. And when he went home to Greece, he brought something back. Something that would transform Western philosophy and plant seeds still growing today. This is where our story really begins. Before we follow Pyro deeper into this journey, I invite you to subscribe to Monk's Temple. If what I shared speaks to you, if you feel that seed of curiosity in your own mind, join us. We explore these ideas every week as practical tools for living with more peace and freedom. Hit subscribe and become part of this community. When Pyro returned to Greece after his years in India, his neighbors noticed something different about him. He seemed untroubled by things that bothered everyone else. He never argued about politics or money. He never seemed eager to get anywhere or anxious about being late. He just was. Stories spread. Some said he was so unconcerned with danger that he would walk toward cliffs if friends did not pull him back. Others said he would keep talking calmly even when people walked away mid-conversation. These stories were probably exaggerated, but they point to something real. Pyro had found a peace that looked strange to people who had never seen it. He began teaching, and what he taught sounded simple. Nothing is inherently good or bad. Our judgments make it so. If you can suspend judgment about things, if you can stop labeling everything as good or bad, you can find peace. This was not just philosophy to Pyro. It was practice. He was not saying good and bad do not exist. He was saying we add something extra to every experience. We add a layer of opinion, a layer of story, a layer of judgment. That extra layer is where suffering lies. Think about something that upset you recently. Maybe someone was rude. Maybe you made a mistake. Separate the event itself from the story you told about it. The event was just what happened. The story included words like should and shouldn't, unfair, not right. The story kept you upset long after the event ended. Pyrrho learned this from Buddhist monks in India. They taught him that the mind constantly builds stories, constantly judges, constantly wants and does not want. This constant activity is exhausting. It is the source of suffering. But they also taught that we can step out of this habit. We can rest in awareness itself, before judgments arise. This is what Pyrrho brought back to Greece. He called it epic, suspension of judgment. Not because judgment is wrong, but because holding judgments lightly brings peace. When we are completely convinced our judgments are absolute truth, we suffer. When we remember they are just opinions, just stories, we relax. Imagine holding a rope tightly in your fist. That is how most of us hold our beliefs. We grip so hard our hands hurt. Pyrrho suggested we could hold them like a feather. We can see them, examine them, even value them, but we do not need to strangle them. Letting go does not mean having no opinions. It means opinions do not own us anymore. Pyrrho's students noticed he was never defensive. If someone challenged his ideas, he listened calmly and often agreed. Not because he had no convictions, but because he did not need to be right. His peace did not depend on winning arguments. This was so unusual in argument-loving Greece that people came from miles away just to watch him. One student asked how he stayed so calm. Pyrrho pointed to a pig eating scraps in the street. The pig was completely content, unconcerned with what anyone thought, unconcerned with status or tomorrow. Pyrrho said that is the secret. The pig does not need philosophy to be at peace because the pig does not tell itself stories. We tell stories constantly and suffer from them. The solution is not to become a pig. The solution is to see through our stories. This teaching spread through the Greek world and influenced philosophers for centuries. But Pyrrho was not the only Greek who brought Buddhist wisdom home. Soldiers who stayed behind in India, merchants who traveled back and forth, ambassadors who served in Buddhist courts carried ideas the way caravans carried silk, quietly transforming both worlds without anyone fully noticing. One such man was a merchant named Sopater who lived in the Greek settlements of Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan. He traded goods between Greek and Indian worlds, but he also traded questions. He sat with Buddhist monks and asked about their practices. He sat with Greek philosophers and asked about theirs. Slowly, he began seeing connections. Sopater noticed both traditions, in their own ways, pointed to the same thing. Freedom from the tyranny of the thinking mind. The Greeks called it ataraxia, freedom from disturbance. The Buddhists called it nibbana, extinguishing the fires of craving. Different words, same human longing. The longing to finally be at peace. Sopater wrote letters home describing what he learned. Some survived, buried in the desert for 2,000 years, rediscovered in the 20th century. In one letter, he describes a conversation with a monk named Nagasena. Nagasena told him, "The mind is like a cup of water with mud in it. If you keep stirring, it stays muddy. If you let it sit still, the mud settles and the water becomes clear. The problem is not the mud. The problem is the stirring." Sopater wrote to his brother in Athens, "I have learned that my suffering is self-inflicted. I stir the water constantly with my thinking, my worrying, my planning, my regretting. The monks have shown me that I can simply stop stirring. The water will clear on its own. This is not something to believe. It is something to try." Another Greek who made this journey was a physician named Xenocles. He traveled to India to study medicine but found himself studying something else. He noticed that Buddhist monks had remarkably low rates of what he called soul sickness, anxiety, depression, restlessness. He observed their meditation practices and realized they were doing something systematic. They were training attention the way athletes train bodies. Xenocles wrote a medical text, now lost except for fragments quoted by later writers. In one fragment, he says, the mind can be strengthened or weakened by practice just as surely as the arm can. Most people exercise their arms but neglect their minds. Then they wonder why their minds are weak when difficulties come. This is the invitation the Greek Buddhists discovered and that is still available to us today. Not to believe something new, but to try something new. To experiment with stopping the stirring. To strengthen the mind through practice. To see what happens when we rest in awareness itself, before judgments arise, before stories start. While Pyrrho took Buddhist wisdom west to Greece, something even more remarkable was happening back east. The Greeks who stayed behind, the soldiers, merchants, and settlers who made their homes in the lands Alexander had conquered, were not just trading goods with their Indian neighbors. They were trading something far more valuable. They were trading their minds. These Greeks built cities in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Cities with Greek columns and Greek theaters and Greek gymnasiums. But something strange began happening in these cities. Right next to the temples of Zeus, Buddhist stupas began appearing. Greek merchants started visiting Buddhist monks. Greek soldiers started sitting in meditation. And Greek kings started asking questions. The most famous of these kings was Menander, who ruled a vast kingdom around 150 BCE. He was powerful, wealthy, and successful by any measure. But the historical texts tell us he was also restless. He had everything and yet felt something was missing. He was a seeker. One day, Menander encountered a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. The king arrived with his full royal court, with soldiers and servants and all the pomp of empire. Nagasena sat alone under a tree with nothing but his robe and his bowl. The king, confident in his Greek education, immediately began firing questions, trying to trap the monk in logical contradictions. He asked the most famous question of all. If a person is reborn, is he the same as the person who died or is he different? Nagasena did not give a lecture. He picked up a lamp. Your Majesty, he said, the flame burning now, is it the same flame that burned at the beginning of the night or a different one? The king saw the trap immediately. It is the same, he said, and yet it is not. It is a continuous process. Each moment depends on the previous moment but is not identical to it. Nagasena smiled. Just so, he said, is the process of rebirth. And just so is the process of your own mind from moment to moment. You are not the same person who walked into this grove, but you are not a different person either. You are a process, a flow. Clinging to a fixed self is like trying to hold on to the flame. It burns you, and it cannot be done. This dialogue between Menander and Nagasena, recorded in the ancient text called the Questions of King Milinda, shows something extraordinary. A Greek mind trained in Aristotelian logic wrestling with a Buddhist mind trained in meditative insight. This was not a conversion where one side won. It was an exploration where both sides found deeper truth. The text says Menander eventually became a monk himself. He gave up his throne to sit under a tree. Whether this is historically accurate or symbolic, the message is clear. Ruling a kingdom is a small task compared to ruling your own mind. Conquering the world means nothing if you have not conquered yourself. But Menander was not alone. Archaeologists have found evidence of dozens of Greek kings who embraced Buddhism. Their coins tell the story. Early coins show Greek gods like Zeus and Athena. Later coins show Dharma wheels and Buddhist symbols. One remarkable coin shows a Greek king seated in the lotus position, the meditation posture, something no Greek ruler had ever done before. What drove these kings to give up everything they had been taught? What made them turn from the gods of their ancestors to the teachings of a man from a different continent? The answer lies in something the Buddhists offered that Greek religion did not. The Greeks had gods who were powerful and beautiful but also capricious and often cruel. You could sacrifice to them, you could beg them for favors, but you could never be sure they would help. The Buddhists offered something different. They offered a path. Not prayers to an outside power, but practices that transform the inside person. Not hope for divine intervention, but certainty that your own efforts could lead to peace. A Greek merchant named Heliodorus left a record of this transformation. In central India, there stands a pillar he erected around 100 BCE. The inscription on the pillar says Heliodorus came from the Greek kingdom of Taxila and was a follower of the Buddha. It is the oldest known inscription by a Western convert to an Eastern religion. Heliodorus did not just convert privately. He built a public monument declaring his new faith. Imagine the courage that took. He was far from home, surrounded by people who did not share his background, and he stood up and said, "This is what I believe. This is what I practice. This has changed my life." Why did he do it? The inscription gives a clue. It says he erected the pillar in honor of the God of gods. For a Greek, raised on Homer and Hesiod, those words would have meant Zeus. But Heliodorus used them for the Buddha. He found in Buddhism something he had been looking for his whole life. Something that felt like it came from a higher source, not from human speculation. This pattern repeated across the Greek world in the East. Not rejection of Greek identity, but expansion of it. These men did not stop being Greek. They remained Greek in language and culture. They just added something new. They added Buddhist practice. They became Greek Buddhists. Think about what that means for your own life. You do not have to reject who you are to grow. You do not have to abandon your culture to learn from another. You can expand. You can include. You can become more than you were while still honoring where you came from. This is what the Greek Buddhists teach us. Identity is not a cage. It is a starting point. For nearly 400 years after the Buddha lived, no one made an image of him. No statues, no paintings, no carvings of his face. This was not an accident. It was a choice. The Buddha had taught about letting go of attachment to the physical world. He had taught that the self is not a fixed thing. To make an image of him felt wrong, like trying to capture something that cannot be captured. So Buddhist art was symbolic. If you visited a holy place, you might see carvings of a riderless horse, representing the Buddha leaving his palace. You might see a Bodhi tree, representing his enlightenment. You might see a pair of footprints, representing his presence on earth. But you would never see his face. He was represented by his absence. Then the Greeks arrived with their sculptors. The Greeks had a completely different relationship with images. Their gods looked like people, perfect people, but people. To make a statue of a god was an act of reverence. It gave the divine a beautiful form. The idea of not making images of important things was, to a Greek, almost disrespectful. So when Greek artists living in Gandhara, in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, heard the stories of the Buddha, they faced a problem. How do you make a statue of a man who taught that the self does not exist? How do you make a statue of someone who is beyond form? Their solution changed the world. They used Greek techniques, the perfect proportions, the realistic muscles, the flowing robes of a Greek god. But they infused them with something new. Look closely at a Gandharan Buddha. The face is calm, but not blank. It is a calm that knows something. The eyes are half closed, looking inward and outward at the same time. The lips curve in a slight smile that is not happiness. It is contentment. It is the peace that comes from understanding. The wavy hair is from Apollo. The robe draped over one shoulder is from a Greek senator. But the long earlobes, stretched from heavy earrings worn long ago, tell the story of renunciation. The bump on the head, the Ushnisha, symbolizes infinite wisdom. The dot between the eyebrows, the Ena, is the third eye, spiritual vision. These artists created a new language. They used stone to show the invisible. They showed the result of enlightenment on a human face. They showed that you could be fully human and fully at peace. You could be in the world but not of it. Imagine one of these artists in a small workshop in Taxila. He has a block of dark stone in front of him. He is Greek. He knows how to carve a perfect bicep, a perfect knee. But his teacher is a Buddhist monk. The monk does not teach anatomy. The monk sits with him in meditation. Feel your own face, the monk says. Not with your hands. With your mind. Feel the stillness behind your eyes. Feel the slight curve of your lips when you let go of a thought. Feel the peace underneath the noise. That is what you carve. The artist picks up his chisel. He is not carving a god anymore. He is not even carving a man. He is carving an invitation. He is carving a reminder to everyone who will look for the next 2,000 years that the peace they seek is already inside them. This new art spread everywhere. Merchants carried small Buddha statues along the Silk Road. Chinese pilgrims took sketches home. Each culture adapted the style. Korea made the faces more angular. China softened the features. Japan refined the proportions. But all kept that original Greek sense of human divinity. The style traveled south too. In the caves of Ajanta, Indian artists merged Greek naturalism with their own flowing lines. In Sri Lanka, the serene smile took on local features while keeping its Greek essence. Southeast Asian Buddhas grew more elaborate but maintained those core Greek proportions. Archaeologists have found the workshops where this happened. In the ruins of ancient cities, they discovered practice pieces, artists learning to carve the perfect curve of an ear, the exact angle of a meditation pose. These were not just copyists. They were creators, inventing a new visual language that would spread across continents. One discovery stands out. In a monastery ruins, researchers found a clay plaque showing the Buddha with the face of Apollo, but with something new in the eyes. The eyes looked inward. The Greeks had given Buddhism a face, and in return, Buddhism had given Greek art a soul. This fusion solved a profound problem. How do you show the face of someone who taught that the self does not exist? Greek artists found a way. They created an image of perfect serenity, a face that shows what lies beyond the self. Every Buddha statue today, whether in a temple or a garden shop, carries the fingerprints of those Greek artists who dared to show the face of enlightenment. There is a story from this period, passed down in oral tradition, about a Greek sculptor named Andreas. He had made statues of gods his whole life. When he first heard about the Buddha, he tried to make a statue using the same methods. It looked like a Greek god sitting cross-legged. It was beautiful but wrong. An old monk visited his workshop. He looked at the statue and said nothing. He just sat down next to it and closed his eyes. After a long time, he opened his eyes and said, "You have made a god sitting still." But the Buddha is not a god sitting still. The Buddha is stillness itself. You cannot carve stillness by looking at a person. You can only carve it by finding it in yourself. Andreas closed his workshop for a year. He meditated with the monks. When he returned, he carved again. This time, the statue was different. It still had Greek proportions. It still had Apollo's hair. But something else was there. Something that made people quiet when they looked at it. Andreas had carved stillness. The art was only the surface. Deep beneath the sculptures and the coins and the temple ruins lay something even more profound. The Greeks and Buddhists were not just making things together. They were thinking together. They were wrestling with the same questions, sharing their answers, and creating something neither could have created alone. In the caves of Bamiyan in Afghanistan, before the tragic destruction of the giant Buddhas, archaeologists made discoveries that rewrote history. They found manuscripts. Not just Buddhist texts in Indian scripts, but Buddhist texts written in Greek letters. Buddhist teachings translated into the Greek language. Buddhist ideas expressed in Greek words. Think about what this means. Monks in these monasteries were not just learning Greek art. They were learning Greek. They were reading Greek philosophy. They were finding ways to express their own wisdom in a foreign language, forcing themselves to find common ground between two completely different ways of understanding the world. One manuscript fragment shows a monk struggling with the concept of emptiness, sunyata. The Greek language had a word for emptiness, kenon, which meant void or empty space. But that was not right. Buddhist emptiness is not a void. It is not nothing. It is the absence of independent existence. Everything is connected. Nothing stands alone. That is what emptiness means. The monk wrote in the margin, "The Greek void is a container with nothing in it. Our emptiness is a net where every jewel reflects all the others." He was building a bridge between worlds with nothing but words on a page. Another manuscript records a debate. A Greek philosopher argues that truth must be permanent and unchanging. If something is true today, it must be true tomorrow. If it changes, it was never really true. A Buddhist monk responds using Greek logic to prove that change itself is the only constant. Everything changes. That is the truth. And it does not change. The debate goes back and forth, each side pushing the other deeper. In the margins of this manuscript, later readers added comments in both Greek and Indian scripts, continuing the debate across centuries. These were not just scholars arguing for fun. These were seekers trying to find the truth, together, across every dividing line. One of the most fascinating discoveries was a medical text. A Greek physician named Demodocus had traveled east and studied with Buddhist monks. He noticed they had remarkably low rates of what he called mind sickness, anxiety, depression, restlessness. He studied their meditation practices and realized they were doing something systematic. They were training attention the way athletes train bodies. Demodocus wrote a text combining Greek medicine with Buddhist psychology. He described the mind as a muscle that could be strengthened or weakened by use. He prescribed meditation for patients with anxiety. He taught breathing exercises for those who could not sleep. He was the first person in history to combine Eastern contemplative practice with Western medical science. A fragment of his text survives. It says, "The mind left untrained runs wild like an unbroken horse. It runs toward every desire and away from every discomfort. This running exhausts the body and sickens the soul. But the mind can be trained. With practice, it learns to rest. With practice, it learns to observe without chasing or fleeing. This rest is not laziness. It is strength. The strongest mind is the mind that can be still." Another discovery shocked researchers. In a monastery library, they found a Greek philosophical text, a dialogue of Plato, but with notes in the margins written by a Buddhist monk. The monk had annotated Plato's arguments about the soul, comparing them to Buddhist teachings about no self. Next to Plato's proof that the soul is immortal, the monk wrote, "The Greeks fear death so much they invent immortality. The Buddha taught us to see through the self that fears. Then death has no target. This is not conversion. This is conversation." The monk was not rejecting Plato. He was engaging with him, learning from him, and offering his own perspective. This is what real wisdom exchange looks like. Not one tradition conquering another, but each tradition growing through contact with the other. The influence of these exchanges rippled outward. In Alexandria, Egypt, Greek philosophers began teaching methods that sound remarkably like Buddhist meditation. They taught students to observe their thoughts without attachment. They taught practices for calming the mind. Was this coincidence? Or had Greek Buddhist ideas traveled west along the same trade routes that carried silk and spices? In the deserts of Egypt, the first Christian monks, the Desert Fathers, used techniques that mirror Buddhist practice. They sat in stillness. They fought with distracting thoughts. They sought inner peace through solitude and silence. Some scholars believe these practices came from the Greek Buddhist monasteries of Central Asia, carried by travelers and traders, adapted for a new faith. The great philosopher Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century CE, taught a method of turning inward to find the source of all things. He described a state beyond thinking, beyond words, beyond the self. His students said he reached this state several times in his life. His descriptions sound like descriptions of Buddhist meditation. Plotinus never mentioned India in his writings, but the parallels are hard to ignore. What these manuscripts show us is a time when East and West were not divided. When Greek and Buddhist ideas flowed freely between minds seeking truth. When a Greek could learn from a monk and a monk could learn from a Greek, and neither felt they were betraying their heritage. They were just finding wisdom wherever it could be found. The Greek Buddhist kingdoms eventually fell. New powers rose from the steppes, new empires conquered the old ones. The monasteries were abandoned. The cities crumbled into dust. The memory of this fusion faded from the world's collective consciousness. But ideas do not die so easily. They go underground. They seep into other traditions. They wait. In the deserts of Egypt, around the 3rd century CE, a new movement began. Men and women walked into the empty wilderness to live alone in caves and small huts. They called themselves the Desert Fathers and Mothers. They sought something they could not find in the noisy cities. They sought stillness. These early Christian monks developed practices that look remarkably familiar. They sat in silence for hours. They repeated short prayers over and over to focus the mind. They fought with what they called logismoi, distracting thoughts that pulled them away from peace. They taught each other to observe these thoughts without acting on them, to let them pass like clouds in an empty sky. Where did these practices come from? The Bible does not describe them. The early church did not teach them. Some scholars believe they came from the East, carried by travelers along trade routes, passed from Buddhist monks to Greek merchants to Egyptian seekers. We cannot prove it, but the parallels are striking. The Desert Father Evagrius Ponticus wrote about 8 kinds of disturbing thoughts, a list that resembles Buddhist lists of mental hindrances. He taught his monks to watch their thoughts without attachment, a practice at the heart of Buddhist meditation. Centuries later, in the Golden Age of Islam, scholars in Baghdad translated every Greek text they could find. They translated Aristotle and Plato. They also translated texts from the Greek Buddhist world, medical texts, philosophical dialogues, meditation manuals. These texts influenced Islamic thinkers in ways we are only beginning to understand. The Sufi mystics of Islam developed practices of remembrance, repeating the names of God until the mind quieted. They taught annihilation of the ego, fana, a state where the separate self dissolves into the divine. This sounds remarkably like the Buddhist goal of no self. The great Sufi teacher Rumi wrote about dying before you die, a phrase that could come straight from a Buddhist text. Was he influenced by these ancient translations? Did the Greek Buddhist dialogues reach him across the centuries? In Persia, miniature paintings began showing wise men with Buddhist features, seated in meditation poses, surrounded by Greek-style columns. Artists combined elements from both traditions without concern for purity or authenticity. They just painted what seemed beautiful and true. The influence traveled east as well. When Buddhism reached China, it encountered Taoism, and a new tradition was born. Chan Buddhism, which became Zen in Japan, has a distinct flavor. It is direct, iconoclastic, paradoxical. It uses crazy questions to break the logical mind. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Show me your original face before your parents were born. These are not traditional Indian Buddhist teachings. They have the fingerprints of Greek philosophy all over them. The Greeks loved paradox. They loved using logic to break logic. The dialogues between Greek philosophers and Buddhist monks in ancient Taxila planted seeds that flowered centuries later in Chinese monasteries and Japanese temples. In Tibet, monks still debate using methods that trace back to these exchanges. They clap their hands and stamp their feet at key moments in argument. They use a technique called prasanga, taking an opponent's logic to its absurd conclusion. This is pure Greek dialectic, preserved for 2,000 years in Buddhist tradition. When you watch a Tibetan monastic debate on YouTube, You are watching a practice that Greek and Buddhist monks developed together long ago. In Europe, these texts were lost for centuries. But during the Renaissance, travelers and scholars began bringing them back. They found manuscripts in monasteries, in libraries, in forgotten caves. They began to realize that ancient Greeks had found wisdom in the East. This realization helped pave the way for the spiritual dialogues we are still having today. A Renaissance philosopher named Gemistos Plethin read some of these texts and was transformed. He began teaching that ancient wisdom came from the East, that Plato had been influenced by Indian sages. His ideas shocked his contemporaries but planted seeds that grew over time. By the 19th century, scholars were openly discussing the connections. By the 20th century, psychologists were incorporating Buddhist ideas into their practice. Carl Jung wrote commentaries on Buddhist texts. Alan Watts popularized Zen for Western audiences. The dialogue that began when Pyrrho sat with monks in India never really stopped. It just went underground for a while. Today, we are part of this dialogue. Every time you read a book about mindfulness, you are continuing it. Every time you sit in meditation, you are continuing it. Every time you question your own thoughts, your own judgments, your own stories, you are continuing the work those Greek and Buddhist seekers began so long ago. The kingdoms fell. The monasteries crumbled. But the conversation continues. And you are part of it. The Greek Buddhist kingdoms eventually fell. New powers rose from the steppes. The monasteries were abandoned. The cities crumbled into dust. The memory of this fusion faded from the world's collective consciousness. But ideas do not die so easily. They go underground. They seep into other traditions. They wait. In the deserts of Egypt, around the 3rd century CE, a new movement began. Men and women walked into the empty wilderness to live alone in caves. They called themselves the Desert Fathers and Mothers. They sought something they could not find in noisy cities. They sought stillness. These early Christian monks developed practices that look remarkably familiar. They sat in silence for hours. They repeated short prayers to focus the mind. They fought with distracting thoughts. They taught each other to observe thoughts without acting on them, to let them pass like clouds. Where did these practices come from? Some scholars believe they came from the East, carried by travelers along trade routes, passed from Buddhist monks to Greek merchants to Egyptian seekers. Centuries later, in the Golden Age of Islam, scholars in Baghdad translated every Greek text they could find. They translated Aristotle and Plato. They also translated texts from the Greek Buddhist world, medical texts, philosophical dialogues, meditation manuals. These texts influenced Islamic thinkers in ways we are only beginning to understand. The Sufi mystics developed practices of remembrance, repeating the names of God until the mind quieted. They taught annihilation of the ego, a state where the separate self dissolves into the divine. This sounds remarkably like the Buddhist goal of no self. The great Sufi teacher Rumi wrote about dying before you die, a phrase that could come straight from a Buddhist text. The influence traveled east as well. When Buddhism reached China, it encountered Taoism, and a new tradition was born. Chan Buddhism, which became Zen in Japan, has a distinct flavor. It is direct, iconoclastic, paradoxical. It uses crazy questions to break the logical mind. What is the sound of one hand clapping? These are not traditional Indian Buddhist teachings. They have the fingerprints of Greek philosophy all over them. In Tibet, monks still debate using methods that trace back to these exchanges. They clap their hands and stamp their feet at key moments. They use a technique called prasanga, taking an opponent's logic to its absurd conclusion. This is pure Greek dialectic, preserved for 2,000 years in Buddhist tradition. In Europe, these texts were lost for centuries. But during the Renaissance, travelers and scholars began bringing them back. They found manuscripts in monasteries, in libraries, in forgotten caves. They began to realize that ancient Greeks had found wisdom in the East. This realization helped pave the way for the spiritual dialogues we are still having today. By the 19th century, scholars were openly discussing the connections. By the 20th century, psychologists were incorporating Buddhist ideas into their practice. Carl Jung wrote commentaries on Buddhist texts. Alan Watts popularized Zen for Western audiences. The dialogue that began when Pyrrho sat with monks in India never really stopped. It just went underground for a while. Today, we are part of this dialogue. Every time you read a book about mindfulness, you are continuing it. Every time you sit in meditation, you are continuing it. Every time you question your own thoughts, your own judgments, your own stories, you are continuing the work those Greek and Buddhist seekers began so long ago. Consider the rise of meditation in schools, in hospitals, in corporations. Millions of people who have never heard of Pyrrho or Menander are practicing what they discovered. They are sitting quietly, watching their breath, observing their thoughts. They are discovering for themselves that peace is not something you find out there. It is something you uncover in here. Consider the scientific study of meditation. Neuroscientists put monks in MRI machines and watch their brains change with practice. They measure decreased activity in the fear center. They measure increased connectivity in attention areas. They are proving with instruments what the monks proved with their lives. The mind can be shaped by practice. There is a story from the ancient texts. A Greek philosopher came to a Buddhist monk and said, "I have studied all the philosophies. I have read all the books. I have debated all the scholars. And still I suffer. What should I do?" The monk said, "You are like a man who has studied every menu in the city but has never eaten. Put down the menu. Taste something." This is the invitation of the Greek Buddhists. Not to believe new things. Not to join a new religion. But to taste. To practice. To experiment with your own mind and see what happens. You do not need to travel to India. You do not need to learn ancient languages. You just need to sit down, right where you are, and pay attention. Feel your breath. Notice your thoughts. See the stories your mind tells. And ask yourself, is this story true? Is this judgment necessary? Is this suffering required? The answers will not come from books. They will come from your own experience. The Buddha said, "Come and see." Not come and believe. Come and see for yourself. The practice is simple. It is not easy, but it is simple. Sit still. Watch your mind. Notice when you grab onto things and when you push them away. Notice the stories you tell. And then, just for a moment, try letting the story go. Try resting in awareness itself, before the judgments arise. Even a few seconds of this rest is enough to show you that another way of being is possible. The Greek Buddhists built bridges between worlds. They translated wisdom across cultures. They created art that still inspires. But their greatest gift was simpler. They showed that peace is possible. Not someday. Not somewhere else. But here. But now. But in you. There is a question that may have been forming in your mind throughout this journey. If the Greek Buddhists were so influential, if they created the first images of the Buddha, if they translated Buddhist texts into Greek, if their kings became monks, then why have most of us never heard of them? Why did this story disappear? The answer tells us something important about how history works and how easily things can be lost. The Greek Buddhist kingdoms existed on the edges of two great civilizations. To the west, the Roman Empire was rising, and eventually it had no interest in preserving the memory of Greek kings who had abandoned their gods for Eastern philosophies. To the east, new powers rose in India, and they had their own heroes, their own stories to tell. The Greek Buddhists fell through the cracks between worlds. When the Islamic conquest swept through Central Asia, many monasteries were destroyed. Libraries burned. Statues were toppled. The great Buddhist centers of learning in Afghanistan and Pakistan became ruins buried under sand and dust. For over 1,000 years, the Greek Buddhists slept beneath the ground, waiting to be rediscovered. Then, in the 19th century, British archaeologists and surveyors began exploring the regions that are now Afghanistan and Pakistan. They found things they could not explain. Coins with Greek gods on one side and Buddhist symbols on the other. Statues of the Buddha with clearly European features. Inscriptions in Greek mentioning Buddhist monks. They had stumbled upon a lost chapter of human history. One of the first major discoveries was at a site called Hatta, near modern Jalalabad in Afghanistan. Archaeologists found thousands of Buddhist sculptures, many of them showing Greek artistic influence. The faces were not Indian. They were Greek. The robes were not Indian. They were Greek. But the subject was the Buddha. The fusion was undeniable. A British officer named Charles Masson explored these sites in the 1830s. He collected thousands of coins and artifacts, sending them back to museums in London and Calcutta. Most people at the time could not make sense of what he found. They had no framework for understanding Greeks and Buddhists together. So the artifacts sat in storage, unstudied, unappreciated, for decades. It was not until the 20th century that scholars began piecing the story together. They realized that the coins told a history. Early Greek kings in the region showed Greek gods on their money. Later kings showed Buddhist symbols. One king, Menander, appeared on some coins as a Greek warrior and on others as a Buddhist devotee. The story was written in metal. In the 1960s, French archaeologists excavated a Greek city in Afghanistan called Ai Khanum. They found a Greek gymnasium, a Greek theater, Greek inscriptions. But they also found Indian artifacts, Buddhist relics, evidence of cultural mixing at every level. One inscription contained maxims from Delphi, the sacred site in Greece, written in perfect Greek. Right next to it, they found a Buddhist stupa. The two worlds lived side by side. Then came the discoveries that changed everything. In the 1990s, a farmer in Afghanistan stumbled upon a cave filled with ancient manuscripts. They were written on bark and palm leaves, some in Indian scripts, some in Greek scripts. Scholars realized these were Buddhist texts, some of the oldest ever found, and some of them were written in Greek. The Greeks had not just admired Buddhism from afar. They had made it their own. They had written about it in their own language. These manuscripts, called the Gontaran Scrolls, are still being studied today. They show Buddhist monks wrestling with Greek concepts, using Greek words to express Buddhist ideas, adapting Greek logic to explain Buddhist causation. They are the library of a civilization that history forgot. One of the most touching discoveries was a small scroll containing a personal letter. A Greek merchant named Theodotus wrote to his brother back home. He described his life in a Buddhist city, his admiration for the monks he had met, his own tentative experiments with meditation. He wrote, "I came here to make money, but I am finding something I did not know I was looking for. The philosophers of our homeland argue about virtue. Here, people practice it. I am learning to sit still. I am learning to watch my mind. I am learning that I am not who I thought I was." Theodotus never returned to Greece. He stayed in the East, married a local woman, raised children who spoke both Greek and the local language. His descendants probably became Buddhists themselves, blending into the population, losing their Greek identity over generations. But something of Theodotus survived. His letter survived. His search survived. And now, 2,000 years later, we can read his words and recognize ourselves in them. The rediscovery of the Greek Buddhists is not complete. Every year, archaeologists find new things. Satellite images show promising sites that have never been excavated. Local legends speak of ruins hidden in mountains, waiting to be found. There may be whole monasteries still buried, whole libraries still preserved, whole stories still waiting to be told. But even with what we have already found, the story is clear. For a few centuries, in a place where East met West, human beings created something beautiful. They built bridges instead of walls. They learned from each other instead of fighting each other. They showed that wisdom has no nationality, that truth speaks all languages, that peace is possible when we are willing to sit down and listen. We have reached the end of our journey together. From the plains of India where Greek soldiers first encountered Buddhist monks, to the courts of kings who gave up thrones for meditation, to the workshops where Greek sculptors carved the first images of the Buddha, to the caves where monks translated wisdom between languages, to the rediscovery of this lost story in our own time. Now we come to you. Because this story was never really about the past. It was about the present. It was about you. The Greek Buddhists discovered something that every generation must discover for itself. That peace is possible. That suffering is optional. That the mind can be trained. That the stories we tell ourselves are not the same as reality. That we can rest in awareness itself, before judgments arise, before labels attach, before suffering begins. This discovery does not belong to any one culture. It does not belong to ancient Greece or ancient India. It belongs to anyone who is willing to look. It belongs to anyone who is willing to sit down, quiet the mind, and see for themselves. You do not need to travel to a monastery. You do not need to learn ancient languages. You do not need to become a Buddhist or a Greek or anything else. You just need to pause. Right here, right now, in this moment. Feel your breath. Notice the awareness behind your thoughts. Rest there, even for a few seconds. That is the beginning. That is the middle. That is the end. The Greek Buddhists built bridges between worlds. They created art that still inspires. They translated wisdom across cultures. But their greatest gift was simpler. They showed that another way of being is possible. Not someday. Not somewhere else. But here. But now. But in you. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this journey has meant something to you, if these ideas have planted seeds in your mind, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not already, consider subscribing to Monk's Temple. We are here every week, exploring these ancient ideas as practical tools for living with more peace and freedom. Until next time, take care of that mind. It is the only one you have. And remember, the temple is not a place you go. It is a place you build within yourself.